This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, PreSonus, API Audio, Isotope, Sound Porter Mastering, JZ Microphones, and Spectra 1964. And you're hearing my voice right now on the JZ BB29 microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX100 mic pre, C610 comp limiter, and Isotope RX and Ozone. So get ready to rock.
The notion of how music is very close to a type of spirituality in terms of what the relationship is between the artist and the audience. On some level, I believe we perceive the artist as this superhuman, thing. And in that moment, I feel like people fundamentally believe that they're on a different stratosphere than these people.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. I've got two words for you that will help you make your best record ever and not lose it. Storage and backup. You want fast drives for composing and recording and reliable drives for backup so you don't lose all your hard work when something goes wrong. That's why I chose OWC Mercury Extreme Pro 6G internal SSDs for my studio computer and Mercury Elite Pro external drives for archiving. Discover the best OWC drive options for your studio at macsales.com/rockstars. The Spectra 1964 STX100 mic pre provides unequaled headroom and linear output regardless of transient audio peaks, capturing critical details from your microphone. The 100 series amplifiers were used by Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, and the Record Plant on records by ZZ Top, Aerosmith, and John Lennon. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio at Spectra1964.com or call them at 801-797-0642. Studio One from PreSonus is the ideal DAW for your home studio, taking you from songwriting all the way through mixing and mastering with a full suite of virtual instruments, guitar amps, and plugins for creative inspiration. It's easy to use for the beginner, yet fully customizable for your high-speed workflow as you become an expert. Get started now with Studio One Artist and PreSonus Sphere for access to all software learning and creative collaboration at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Kevin McMahon of Marcata Recording, first started by the Walkmen in 2000 as a purely analog facility located in Harlem inside what had been a Nascar production facility. Kevin joined the studio in 2003 and took over daily operations, bringing his collection of vintage microphones, preamps, and a long history of studying great live performances from his decade working as a live sound engineer and designer at the now defunct but not forgotten venue, Brownies in New York City's East Village. Doing live sound is where Kevin developed his love of living interactions between musicians and the ability to recognize the spirit of an artist's vision and to act with a sense of urgency towards nurturing an environment to allow that vision to be realized at any cost. Some of Kevin's credits include bands like Real Estate, Pile, Parlor Walls, Mr. Gnome, The Walkmen, The French Kicks, Diarrhea Planet, and Herzog, just to name a few of the many bands he's worked with. So also want to give a shout out and a thank you to Caleb for making our introduction. Thanks, Caleb. Please welcome Kevin McMahon to Recording Studio Rockstars. Kevin, are you ready to rock, dude?
I'm ready to rock.
Well, I'm glad to have you here, man. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. It was great to meet you and a lot of fun to go listen to your music and really quickly get a sense of where I think your skills lie, which we'll get into. But tell us a little bit about yourself. I gave a very brief background, but tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you got into recording music.
I've been playing music my whole life. And around the 17-year mark, I was confused compared to all the other musicians that I knew who were pretty happy playing music. Basically, I felt pretty lost in that I liked making sounds and doing things, but I didn't have the same sort of drive as other bands to do things like play gigs and put out records and stuff. And it was really confusing. I'd never been in a studio, didn't really think about a studio.
And tweet about yourself.
Yeah. And then I ended up doing an internship at a studio, and it all clicked in together. And I kind of had an epiphany at that moment that this is really what I needed to be doing.
Where was that? Was that in New York City?
No, that was up in Maine, actually. It was in Portland, Maine, at this studio called Sound Harbor Studio.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And I interned there for a while and tried to find, local bands in the Maine area up there, and then eventually moved from there to San Francisco. And then from San Francisco, I ended up in New York, which is where I should have gone in the first place.
Yeah, Portland, Maine is such a fantastic town. I love that place. It's such a wonderful vibe. I only know it passing through every summer. And I believe our mutual friend Caleb is there, right?
Yeah. And we met through doing some work. It was with Swans, but he coincidentally, many years later, ended up working at that same studio that I was at. And we had a few chance, meetings many, many years ago when he was playing at Brownies. And then again, we worked remotely through Swans. And then, but we've gotten to meet each other this year. And he and Colleen and their awesome family and band are up there.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, was Brownies the club that was kind of like a sort of a curved airplane hangar ceiling inside or something? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. Yeah. It was a lot like, I'm trying to remember the name of the place that the Beatles used to play at. Whenever I see those pictures maybe it was the Tunnel. I don't know. But it had that curved ceiling, which that place just really sounded amazing. That ceiling really gave it, I understood an important thing by working there with that ceiling. Like the sound filled the room, and the way that ceiling worked, I felt gave it a sense of compression, if that makes, not like a compressor compression, but just a vessel being filled and the air moving in a certain way because it was filled. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but
sure. I think I played there in the 97.
Oh,
I don't know if you were there then, but with the band Grover I was touring with, and we played this show there.
Yeah, I was there the whole time they were open. I guess they were open maybe a year before I got in there. But
do you think you probably mixed sound for us?
There's a strong chance. Actually, I'm really bad with names as a result of doing sound and meeting 35 people a night and trying to remember names. But the faces, and actually strangely the names, like I can visualize the set lists that were on the walls pretty clearly a lot when band names come up, and I'll be like, oh, I remember seeing that on the wall.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I think we were there for the CMA Awards or something like that.
Oh, like maybe the CMJ.
I mean, sorry, not
the
CMA.
Festival?
CMJ. Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Well, very cool. So all right. So you started out interning in the studio up in Portland, and then made your way down to New York. And do you want to share some stories about studios on route, or tell us about where you are now?
Yeah. I mean, the studios that I didn't spend a bunch of time in studios in the city. I think I ended up being really entrenched in live sound pretty quickly, as I think really a result of just needing to make an income, and as opposed to doing the intern thing in there, I started doing sound pretty quickly. I don't know if that answered.
Sure. Yeah. So you switched over to live sound and got pulled into that. What was some of the stuff you felt like some takeaways from doing live sound? What did you enjoy about it? And what were some things about live sound that you learned that you wanted to take into the studio later?
I feel like what I do well has a lot to do with being around bands playing gigs. In the bio or the intro that you read, that kind of touches on that. It's like I was so informed by watching or really hearing what a band did live. And I can remember many of those bands, I would see them live, then I would hear their record, and I would be like, these records don't even sound like this band. Because of some, and I think there's a lot of different nuances that can be about. But certainly I feel like what I learned there was really about a dynamic energy that happens live that is often not in records. And then I think, the other aspect of it that was really important was just being on your toes at all moments and not really having, an opportunity to sort of get things right. Actually, Brownies, we didn't really do sound checks for many, many years in there. So everything was really just about being like, here it comes, and be ready and turn it into something that sounds like music really quickly.
Yeah.
And then sort of understanding the energy and certain things about the way bands play. I think one thing that was really interesting to me was the idea that bands rarely know, what their performances are. And there's often a sense of people coming off a stage and thinking that they just had like an awful show. And, everybody in the audience was like slayed. And where am I going with that is, I think to this day, and I don't know if you encounter this too, but a lot of times when people are performing, and you're recording them, they'll, right after they did 2 or 3 takes, they'll comment on what was good and what wasn't good. And I find myself trying to encourage people, to sort of quiet that voice a little bit. It's not necessarily that they may not be right, but the idea of what we felt when we were doing something, sometimes the potential discomfort, of something going on might be something that we reacted to musically in a really important way that only the audience can see.
Right.
So I've come to sort of believe, that you really can't necessarily successfully multitask in that idea of performing and listening. So I try and, do things to keep the artist in a performance, space, and segregate entirely the idea of, evaluation. Anyway, and I think, that was very much an influence of the live, area.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the idea that like, just that reminder that when you're in the moment and you're performing, you can't possibly really be listening at the same time. So learning to let go of the self-critique that follows right after the performance, because you kind of think you heard something, but maybe you're not accurate about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to know how I get a consistent sound quality mixing hundreds of episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars? Well, I've been cheating all along by using Isotope RX and Ozone on every single episode. Right now, you are hearing RX declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, EQ, and limiting on my voice. If you want great consistent mixes too, go to isotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off. Have you ever struggled to finish a mix wondering if it was truly ready for mastering? Wouldn't it be great to have a trusted coach walk you through the final stages of mixing so that you could confidently deliver your mix for professional mastering, knowing that it was just right? At soundporter.com, home of the iterative mastering process, Brian Murphy is your trusted coach to listen to your needs and help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo at soundporter.com. There's been a ton of times where I've recorded with my band where we did a lot of live to 2-track recordings, and we would go and we do a take, and then we go and we do a second take, and we'd think that we got all the stuff right in the second take. We'd fix all of our errors and everything, and then go back later and ultimately pick the first one because it just had the excitement and the energy to it.
Yeah. It's and even the pursuit of perfection in a way that is able to analyze things and look at them and do it again. To me, there's a big fuzzy line between when that's amazing and saves the process and when that is just sort of a thing that might make the person show up without the idea that they don't have that, so they really have to be ready. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's not making sense.
Like the pressure of the moment.
And just to be the thing that you're wanting it to sound like at the end, as much to show up with that. I think there's a lot of little connecting dots that come off of that little example that are all about where the studio as a place to perfect things is a great thing to be able to do. Mm-hmm. And I tend to believe in that process a lot more when somebody doesn't want to do it, they're, because then I see it as the potential of being able to save an otherwise brilliant performance, but the person is showing up thinking that it's all about really giving the performance, and not, either whether or not it's evaluating the takes that you did, and that seeming like an impossible thing, or something related to that, which is okay, but if you are evaluating what you're doing while you're doing it, you're probably concentrating on that. And is that the thing that you would do if you were, and is that the thing you would do when you're in the heat of the moment and putting on the best show ever? And this, gets back to the live thing. The live sound thing is, to me, it was very much fascinating to just be what makes an amazing show an amazing show. It's and you see a band 10 times and it's okay, they're playing the notes every time, and variables of these are amazing and when they're not, and to really just try and understand that place in making records. And it's, everything as in the studio, it's the setup, the idea that the band comes in on the day that they're going to record something and they do every single thing completely different than they've ever done it before.
Right.
It's well, here's all the money in my pocket.
Well, I mean, I feel like I see examples of it all the time in small bits too. So for example, somebody will say something or they'll sing something and it'll be just brilliant. And then they'll be okay, cool. And then they'll do it again and they'll try and intentionally do it. And it just lost everything that just happened a moment ago when they weren't thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's fascinating to think about that, that idea of seeing the band perform so many times in a live setting that you begin to study that and understand what goes into the whole band doing that all together. I wrote that down. What makes an amazing performance? So what are some things that you would like to say about, answering that question? I mean, what are some things that you learned about what makes an amazing performance for a band?
I tend to think that a lot of it is very related to acting, and being in a character,
Totally.
following following some, having a vision, letting that vision be the thing that you're guiding yourself. Even I find myself saying some things to bands that are even about like letting themselves believe, that they're maybe a little bit more self-important than as a person you would want them to necessarily be, because there's this thing about what makes most of the music that is successful, in quotes there, because that's such a massive statement in terms of what it is. And there's all different types. It's not all about like a certain intensity. But I definitely feel like the notion of how music is very close to a type of spirituality in terms of what the relationship is between, the artist and the audience. And how that, on some level, I believe we perceive the artist, in quotes, as this superhuman, thing. We can all relate that to some very famous person that we might have an opportunity to see. And in that moment, I feel like people fundamentally believe that they're on a different stratosphere than these people, even if they're in the room. Even if they're right next to them, that there's a sense of it's only voyeurism because this person exists in a plane that you do not exist in. Right. So there's something bigger than life. And I think, again, it's a super fine line because, that self-awareness of somebody knowing that they think that about themselves potentially backfires pretty quick. But I think when people are just floating along and not thinking about that, and trying to understand like what it means to stand out when you just look at the statistics of how many people, have performed and have made, music or whatever the form of art you're doing. It's like, what does it mean for an individual to like, get to the point of fame and all these things, I think, touch on this thing of bigger than life. So I think like trying to believe that and to believe that the thing that you're doing is that, and that the vision, whatever that is super palpable to you. And in some cases, I guess somebody like, Marilyn Manson or, people who obviously put a mask on. The metaphor is that even if your image is somebody like,
Alice Cooper.
Yeah, well, and like Kiss, these are the obvious ones that put this on. But even somebody like Elliott Smith or
everybody does.
Nick Drake or somebody is like, I think the mistake can be that there isn't that persona, and I think a lot of that is because there's a lot of effort put into making all of this stuff look like it's just everybody's shooting from the hip, at all times, and that there's not as much, work into that thing. But I think it's easy. And I would also say, I think indie, like alternative music, I think really opened up a certain door for that had been closed in terms of really being like, this is about the every person, the every, whether or not you know how to play or not. In fact, actually at the height of the alternative music thing, I feel like if you could play, it was a detriment, on a certain level, to be classically like, not like as in classical music, but to be really well trained. So, all of those things I think spin this idea that makes it easy for bands not to think about this. Ironically, I feel like it's the opposite with regard to a thing that's related to it, like the PR awareness that people have come into in the last, I don't know, I'm not sure I'll be
What do you mean by that? You mean like social media and things like that?
Yeah. That I think we're actually culturally as a species and as different societies, we are at the height of people always propagating some image. Which seems like that would be related to what I think an artist needs to let themselves like consider, but I somehow feel like they're the opposite of one another, like the PR. And when I guess I say PR, awareness, I think I remember probably 10 years and in the past behind that, feeling like you needed to introduce many artists to this concept that there was such a thing as PR. And that there was a such thing as an image, and that it wasn't just that if your music was really good, suddenly all of these magazines all over the country were just coincidentally going to start reviewing your record. It's like so there had been a time when I feel like I used to need to introduce that to some bands in terms of them being able to follow up on a momentum that they have going and sort of quote unquote play the game, if they're trying to be a part of that, put records out like, on labels and stuff like that a lot of bands would not necessarily want to think that thing existed.
Yeah. I like that you're introducing, you're like one of the few people to come forward and go, hey, I think social media is actually pretty good.
Well,
there's a positive side to it.
But that isn't, because really that I don't think that is what I'm saying. I think that would be a potential upside, but I feel like it quickly went in the other direction super quickly, where bands knew more about their PR presence and their image than they knew about their music.
Right.
And I kind of feel like that's changing a little bit just because I think PR seems to have changed. And
there's also like endless takes in the social media thing. You perform that riff 50 times until you nail it. And then that's the one you share on Instagram.
Yeah.
API Audio has been designing mic pre's, compressors, and EQs for more than 50 years. Every product they make includes founder Saul Walker's original proprietary op amps and transformer designs to make sure you always get that legendary API sound in your studio. Whether you are writing songs for fun or mixing Grammy-winning hits, API has got you covered with individual modules, rack units, and dedicated consoles to make sure your next record is your very best. Go to APIaudio.com. Sometimes you just need a mic that will stand out in a mix. That's when you need the new BB29 Signature Series from JZ Microphones. The unique single diaphragm golden drop capsule gives the BB29 airy highs and smooth mid-range to help your tracks stand at the front of your mix. JZ's handcrafted, fully discreet microphones come with a 5-year warranty and free shipping to the US. You're hearing my voice on the BB29 right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. At the risk of making this an about social media episode, let me spin you back for a sec, because this is some cool stuff. But let's help paint the picture of you and where you work a little more too. Tell us about Marcata recording and where I know right now we're in quarantine and all that kind of stuff, and this will be coming out later anyway. But where you typically are working, tell us a bit about your studio and what your work environment looks like.
So we had this amazing space that the Walkmen had started down in the city, and it was just in a big live, very live sounding room, and all of their earlier records just really sound amazing in that particular way. And when we eventually got booted out of there, I was able to find this barn upstate in New Paltz, which is about an hour and a half north of the city.
Nice.
And so there was a barn that had been a recording studio, and it had sort of just been floating around, maybe not doing as much stuff. A few different, owners were there. When I first put any equipment in there, it was because I just thought I was going to store things there, because we got moved out of the Harlem location pretty quickly, and then I needed a place to put stuff. So this barn it's probably about 175 years old, in the oldest section of it. There's a few different sections. It is a barn on what had been a veal farm. Wow. And it's at the base of the Catskills out, and there's 44 acres, that look out over these beautiful mountains off in the side. And so I've got a live room with a control room, attached to that, and the exterior barn. If you imagined a rectangle, and I think the whole barn's probably about 6,000 square feet, I'd say a quarter of that is a box that's built out that has a control room with a room on top of it. And that room and the control room both overlook into the live room. The live room's probably about 800 square feet, maybe.
Wow. Nice.
It's got a piano and some other things in there, so it doesn't feel as spacious as I think I'd like it to, but it's a little similar to yours. It's got 34-foot ceilings in it, so it's a very tall room, and there's a lot of irregular angles and stuff in there. And it's just,
does it have the kind of reverb time that the studio in Harlem did, or is it a different kind of echo?
It's very similar to that, It's the room in Harlem was definitely a lot deeper and had like a pit that went down into it, so you could put the drums down very far from the ceiling, or you could put the drums up on a level where they were closer to the ceiling, and then you still had the room. But it's very bottom, like drum sound, that happens in there, and I feel like you can hear that on most of the things that I do are pretty live.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a bunch of the questions I want to ask you is about that sound. But what are some of the things about a room that you feel like physically in a room that actually give it a live sound? Anything you've learned from that?
Yeah. Well, I left as many of this reflective surfaces as I could, and I actually built a little drum platform. And a lot of times I take the rug off of that. To me, I'm kind of in the opposite end as most studios. I feel like reflective surfaces, and then randomizing those so that you don't get a lot of ping-pongy, weird, problematic stuff is definitely a thing. I think there's a really great attribute of this barn being as old as it is, that the floors move. It's not like one of those places where the floor is like cement and dead. So
like the Indiana Jones movie, it's like, why is the floor moving, Indy?
Yeah. I feel like the floor becomes a little bit of a timpani membrane unto itself, and so you get a lot of sound from the foundation, which I think in classic sensibility about studio design are all things that I see people go to great lengths to undo, in their rooms. And
you like using that as part of the sound, like it's part of the instrument.
Yeah, it's absolutely part of the instrument. And I lot of the, I think the ceiling height and room for sound to travel and expand, I think I can hear that in a dimension to the drums, if that makes any sense. Like there's the volume difference for dynamics that you would encounter, but I think that, similar to what I was making reference to earlier at Brownies, the way that room would fill up with sound. Yeah. And be sort of like a tight, thing, because it felt like the sound was, putting pressure. This is sort of different in that the size of the ceiling, I think, lets things expand. Yeah. I know that I use a lot of room mics in there, but I feel like I'm touching on something that is maybe similar to, the way ribbon mics are often called velocity. Microphones. there's something that I'm touching on that is different from just saying like, oh, you have a room and you have a room mic in there so you can hear something that's further away and maybe more diffused. I think I'm specifically feeling like that there's something about the height and the size that lets the immediacy of the sound show more dynamics. In them. And I'm not sure that that's not just a superstition, that I like to follow, but that's the way it feels to me.
Well, so one of the bands that you work with is a band called Pile, and that one particularly has a great room sound to it. It's like you really hear, I don't know, it just sounds like the whole, sounds like a band in a room, and so I had a couple of questions about that, which you're starting to address now. Mm-hmm. What are some thoughts you have about getting that great, capturing the band in a room sound so that it really does have that quality, but it's also not too boomy and the low end is in control? Because I think you do a great job with that. Yeah. And then there's some other stuff. There's plenty of other questions I got for you around that too. But, and drums as well. What are some things about recording the drums that make it work and, have that toughness of filling up the room? And I guess, like, where do guitar amps go? Do they just fill the room with the drums? Is it important, like a stage, to have everything just filling up the space together?
I definitely spend a pretty good amount of time trying to analyze what the dynamics of enough of the pieces of music are so that I can get some kind of a setup and try and understand how much of it is going to be relying on bleed, and not. I think the drums are always like in that big space, and I have gobos and things around them that I can make like really tight. I think I try and create some pretty strong barriers between the close mics and the room mics.
What does that mean? Some pretty strong barriers?
Like directional ones. Often I have like a room mic sort of in a corner. Like I've got the drums, they're generally facing diagonally, like in the room, which, whether or not it's, again, superstition, we can talk about superstition. I love superstition. I think it's incredibly important to the making of like really good art. And sometimes the superstition is just total dog shit, wrong, and then other times it's right. But
that's part of the performance, or that's part of the character too. It's like, yeah. You have to embrace the character of the whole process.
Yeah. And that the process is really important to getting a unique, thing. So the drums are sort of diagonal in there. And often, as one example of this barrier, there'll be, a room microphone. I usually use about four or more, room microphones, and I have places high and low to do stuff. But I'll definitely want to put something between it, even if it's close to it, or for that matter, like if I'm trying to create. See, this is multi-tangential in here. Even like a tip for getting like a big sound is, a lot of times I see people putting room microphones like up in the air over something because they're trying to get the far away like sound. Mm-hmm. And I've kind of discovered that, something like a cardioid microphone, like right in front of the drum set, pointing away from the drum set with something behind it, is liable to be a further away sound. Or even like aiming room microphones like at the floor that are sort of next to the drum set with like the null point maybe pointing at the drum set, so that the sound that has, being aware of where the sound travels, what the path of the microphone, or the sound to the diaphragm, is, and creating places for that direct sound to have to travel to it and not get too many of the early reflections, or things. So I guess just a lot of isolation in what the far away sound sources are.
Right. So when you say direct sound traveling, I think you mean, if I'm hearing you right, I think you're saying if you've got a room mic for the drums, you hit that snare, it goes right into the snare mic. Don't let that snare go straight across the room right into the room mic. make it have to work for it by bouncing off as many surfaces as possible before it gets to the room mic.
Yeah, and try and actually create something that stops it, So I guess,
Right.
When I'm using baffles like in the room, like around the drums, I guess I'm not consciously thinking that much about keeping the sound off the drums. I'm actually trying to create like a very distinctly different space that the room microphones are in, what information they're getting, and what the close-up, mics are. And, and then from there, I feel like I do a lot of testing to get a balance of, what guitar amps are going to be in there. I don't really ever put a bass amp in the room with the drums.
Okay.
That usually tends to go in this like ISO booth that's parked off to the side, but I'll sometimes leave the door open to some degree and let some of that come in. But I'll usually definitely put a guitar amp in there and try and make the room microphones get like a pretty good read of a band playing, if that's the thing.
Yeah.
And if there's somebody in the band who's playing something that, is totally experimental or is not going to live to see the light of day, then I might try and put that speaker, either isolate it more or put it in some other location so it's not in there. But I'll spend a lot of time designing what the bleed factor is. And I've done a lot of the records that I have without headphones. And I really enjoy that, process because, again, getting into that idea of bands doing everything different, and frankly, I work, I think, with drummers really hard on dynamics and really explaining just some physics things about what a microphone is going to do that's different from, things. And I feel like between compression, but just the medium itself, that you lose some of the dimensions. So I really will work with drummers to try and get them to heavily exaggerate their dynamics, be very aware of, in particular, like how they hit their metal, like the cymbals. That, in my experience, you put headphones on and immediately there's two things, and neither of them are good, in my opinion. For recording drums that happen is you can't hear the high end as you're accustomed to hearing it. So you tend to hit your cymbals much harder, particularly like the hi-hat, which just every microphone typically becomes like a hi-hat mic.
It's worse than the tambourine.
Yeah. And then the other one, this one, I started playing drums maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and this is when I discovered this one. The low end that's always there from the kit, on the kick drum and the snare drum, and the way your body feels that when you're playing, that is heightened because you're not hearing any of the high end. So I believe you're more aware of the feel of the low end. And it tells you that you must be really hitting the drum really nice and hard. And so I feel like the headphones in general are kind of death for really good drum performances in general because of that. So I don't know. I feel
I'm just fascinating. You're not losing me at all. I'm with you, and I'm like bouncing on my toes hearing this, because I think of the times with my band where we've done live to 2-track, and we did one record in particular where we set up a vocal PA in there and did it that way. And sure enough, we got so many great performances, and the drums too were like that. We were all in one room, and the drums were like, I think there was just 157 over the drum kit and a kick and a snare mic. But then the way that it spoke in the room filled up, and the low end felt great. And I love hearing that stuff. And I like that you remind us that, because I definitely hear that in your recordings. This like, there's this deep power to the low end that's happening on certain drum hits and between the band and stuff. And it's cool to hear you describe that as if that was there all along. You just didn't let the recording process fuck it up and remove it from what the band would typically do, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I also, I learned, like I did a short couple of years where I was mastering quite a bit. And that, I think I learned everything in that time period.
Nice.
I certainly learned how to like mix and learned about, things like dynamics, in general. Dynamics are so huge. Like compressors are such like a misunderstood, overused, like thing. It's like when I track a band, and I don't know if you do anything similar. Like the studio I have it's not a commercial, entity. It's like pretty off the grid, very low profile. And because of that, it's like it's set up the way that I use the studio. It's not ever, it's like I basically have 32, mics up at any time.
During the height of record making, the Spectre 1964 100 series preamp was the perfect choice to build consoles for Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, Ardent Studios, and New York City Record Plant, bringing you the sound of ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, King Crimson, John Lennon, and many more. The 100 series amplifiers offer extremely stable, high-speed circuit design with unequaled headroom, low noise, and linear output, irrespective of transient audio peaks, giving you cleaner, punchier, dynamic recordings. The Spectre 1964 legacy is carried on today through Bill Cheney and Jim Romney. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio with the STX Mic Breeze, BBDI, and comp limiters. Go to Spectre1964.com or call 801-797-0642. You're hearing my voice right now on the JZ BB29 microphone, the Spectre 1964 STX 100, and C610 comp limiter. A gold bar should be kept safe in a vault because it's valuable, but it could be replaced if it was ever lost. One of your songs or recordings, on the other hand, is worth more than gold because it's one of a kind. It's you, and if it was ever lost, it could never be replaced. So wouldn't you feel better knowing your music was safe? This is why I like to have a dedicated system drive, audio work drive, virtual instrument storage drive, cloud storage, and an extra large backup drive in my studio computer. And when I'm finished with the project, I move it onto a dedicated pair of external drives for archiving. Thanks to OWC, I can count on my drives being super fast, reliable, and secure so that I can work quickly and sleep soundly at night knowing my music is safe. I want your music to be safe too. Discover the best options for storage and backup for your studio from OWC at macsales.com/rockstars. Have you ever wished you could remove the click-track bleed from a singer's vocal mic, the sound of shuffling feet from a full choir, or clicking noises from the valves of an otherwise brilliant trumpet solo? These are just some of the incredible things I've been able to clean up, edit, or remove from a recording using the magic of iZotope RX. Great for mixing with a collection of plugins for your DAW to manage plosives, clicks, S's, noise, buzz, reverb, breaths, and even guitar fret squeaks with the set-it-and-forget-it simplicity that lets you focus on your creativity in the studio while you let iZotope handle the audio challenges. If you've ever wanted to truly feel like a magician in the studio, then iZotope RX is your magic wand. Go to iZotope.com/rockstars in the show notes and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off your first purchase. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session, second half of the show with Kevin McMahon joining us from, where are you? Are you in New York City right now, or are you in New York State? You're in Upper New York State, right?
Upstate New York, yeah, in New Paltz.
I said it all wrong. Upstate New York, yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
And let's dig in and talk a little bit more about your studio. So you just started to talk about the studio and some of the cool gear you have. And I'm looking at your equipment page right now, and it's just like a mouth-watering collection of cool ass shit, including the photos of stacks of racks of gear. But one of the things that I noticed is you have a lot of interesting mic preamps and cool mics as well. And talk a little bit about some of the ways you like to set up. You were talking about like having things pre-patched in into specific mic chains.
Yeah. I keep the studio pretty much strung up at all times, just to minimize the sense of, setup time and other things. And I think over the years, though it may sound like it's a rote sort of approach to it, I can get pretty blasé about the differences between microphones. Like I know that they have them, but I feel like the time period in my life that I was the most fascinated with, splitting hairs between this mic and this mic and this mic, rather than, having settled in on a few things that are more topographical. Like for instance, it's like I pretty much always use the Telefunken U47 with this Langevin 516 preamp that I have, just because of thinking about the topography of it, the type of, a tube with a tube, although the Langevin has a different, thing. There are, sorry, that didn't make sense. There ribbon mics that I like to use with certain things. And I've paired together a bunch of things and just sort of let those be, what is always there.
They're kind of like guitar amp combos sometimes, a good mic and the right pre.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. And I think that that's also that I differentiate pretty strongly between the mission when you're tracking the live part of it from when you're getting, sounds. So for me, I'm documenting things during the basics, quite a bit more than the other stages. So, so there's, I like ribbon microphones quite a bit, which we all seem to like.
You got some interesting ones on your list. I don't know if some of these may not be ribbons, but you have Nakamichi mics. I have a Nakamichi cassette deck.
Oh yeah. Yeah. They're, these Nakamichi mics, are pretty beloved by like tapers who do show, like live recording. They're omnidirectional. They're very clinical, and, just small diaphragms. So have a tight, sort of pickup pattern and all that.
Nice.
The ribbon microphones, there's a friend of mine, Ed Podokar, who makes these.
Is that the Podophone?
The Podophones, and they're just outstanding mics. I'm not sure if he's still making them. He may have stopped. I think I'm not exactly sure. They're such amazing microphones, and I am always talking about them, but I haven't seen too many of them around in other places. But they're outstanding.
Yeah, you're just talking about them to make us all jealous since we can't get them, right?
Well, no, I think you can actually if you look up Podophone, and he's got a really good passive ribbon and a active ribbon, and he also makes some. They're like the Cloud Lifter,
okay,
like a pre FET, bass thing.
So Potofone.
Yes.
Rockstars.
Yeah.
Yep. And then let's see, you've got a Stedman listed there, the classic old Octavas. Lomo. Yeah. And a bunch of other cool stuff. EV. Large diaphragm condenser. I know EV made some great velocity ribbon mics too. Which I've used before. Great guitar sounds.
Yeah.
What are some mics that you enjoy choosing to put on a guitar amp?
The guitar amp, I usually, when I'm recording guitars for basics, I will use a little bit of a different setup than when I'm overdubbing stuff. And so I usually use that Stedman large diaphragm dynamic mic, and I pair that up with an RCA 74 Junior. It's not the sevens. Those things are they're really, I don't know whether or not they have caught on more. I mean, everybody knows about the 44 and the 77, and these are obviously very different, but they're really awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
You got a pair of them. I call them the RCA 74 Juniors. They're like 44 Juniors, I guess.
Yeah.
I have a couple here. Mine are very different from each other, and they're labeled Fatty and Skinny are the two names on them. And once one of the ribbons went out, and I was like worried about getting the tech, and I was just like, screw it. I'm just going to see if I can open it up and see what's inside. And I actually reattached the ribbon, and it worked. I couldn't believe it, because I don't think you can get away with that with a Coles or anything like that.
I mean, the Coles and there's basically the ribbons that have the really large ribbon, and then the Coles, and there's a really good RCA and a few others that have these like really teeny ribbons, and I think those are pretty hard to get into. It's kind of fascinating in understanding like how those things are made. I mean, when you re-ribbon them, you get a sheet of that ribbon, and you have to cut it, and then you have to corrugate it in order to tension it, and then you've got to hang it in the magnet. And it's amazing to me that the people who do that actually do that. I just assumed you would buy something that was machine cut, but I guess they just have these sheets of ribbon, and they're actually needing to cut them, and then they got to corrugate it to put the little That's
really wild.
Yeah. Is your the one that you fixed? Is it the fatty or the skinny?
I can't remember. It might be the fatty, but I couldn't believe that it sounded pretty cool after I fixed it. But I love those mics. They're very cool for. I would use them for sort of character stuff. I like it on guitars. I haven't tried it enough on drums, though. I probably need to do that. Tell us a little bit about some of the mic choices that you enjoy for your room mics when you're getting these cool big room sounds. Do you tend to like the ribbon mics for that, or do you have a whole collection?
No, I've got basically I've got a Sheps small diaphragm Omni that I am not sure I remember the model number of, and that one I usually pair with a couple of 414s. And then I have this CAD E300, which is not technically a fantastic mic. Sometimes even those Octavos I'll do. I think with the room mics, I tend to feel like they are perspective more than I mean, I do have the Sheps on there, which is a really good mic. But basically what I was about to say is like, at that point in it, what's more important to me than what the microphone is that I'm stacking up a bunch of different pictures of the room. And that I have something that is, of a topograph. I think very topographically in terms of what the gear is. What are the principles of how it's like working? So even like when I use the Stedman N90 with the ribbon microphone, it's really that I'm interested in one type of a mic and another type of a mic, almost the way if you mic your bass and put a DI on there, they're really letting you access different aspects of the sound.
Interesting,
so the hope is that you can get like a full blown sound, because I feel like mics themselves. I mean, mics are just weird, it's definitely a weird thing. And the translation between, standing in a room and hearing something and having the inspiration to record it, and then understanding that you're going to stick these microphones, up on things up close, and the mics themselves have their own sound. And then, none of it should work actually, but it seems to. So with the room microphones, and actually the same with, drums, I use a lot of microphones, and I tend to record things that might seem redundant, but there's usually something in what the gear is, or what the chain was, or its location, that all sort of stack up a thing that I'm really just trying to get as many pictures as I can at that moment when the band's performing, to be like, whatever I need to turn this into, I need to be able to do that.
Now, do you feel like each one of those, if you was to solo one of those mics, do you feel like each one sort of stands on its own, is interesting enough to listen to? Or do you feel like it's more like you've got a half of a sound here and a quarter of a sound here, and anything like that?
I think it's a combination of that. I tend to, out of all the mics I'm using, especially like on the drums, I'm not like miking the top and the bottom of the toms or anything like that. I do mic the top and the bottom of the snare, and I put usually 3 microphones, on the snare. But that, again, is because I want a dynamic and I want a condenser, and then the one on the bottom because they'll show me different things. But
right.
So there'll be area mics around that. And so it's a combination of all of them coming together. And often that many mic choices lets me do something like, okay, the attack on the kick drum in the set, in this whole sound, is kind of on this microphone rather than EQing more attack into the kick drum on the kick drum mic, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then, but it will often also facilitate, because most of the microphones that I'm using are sort of, around it, that they will all sort of pick up one full picture of the kit. So a lot of times in the production, idea of wanting to go to a different sound, that is certainly like a thing that I do all the time, that I make some very huge sounding change that really amounted to being like, oh, the drum sound was made up of these microphones. And when we came into this other section, I ditched all of those and I used this one microphone. Mm-hmm. And that inherent, gives like a whole different sound, very quickly unto itself.
All right. So help us keep guiding our hand here, because mm-hmm. I've certainly put a lot of microphones on the drums and caused it to sound like shit before. So help mm-hmm. us understand some of the ways to approach this. So for example, if you're going to put up, I don't know which mic, pick one, and you're going to put it, and it has this thing you just described as kind of a complete picture of the drum kit. Mm. What are we talking about? A mic that's way across the room for this room creation that you're talking about, or are we talking about one that's closer, like an overhead would be? And then, how do you and you have a mic that you said, oh, I might cut to this one mic in the bridge. Now did that one mic live with the others in the verse and chorus and still sound good, or is it more like you have to have some on, you can't listen to them all at once? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I usually have them all on at once. And it's completely factual that, a little bit adds something to it. Right. But I'd say a lot of times, cause there's liable to be 18 mics on the drums.
Wow.
Awesome. And so those, really, by the time I'm looking at the levels in there, many of those microphones are almost turned off when I get whatever the
mix wise.
Yeah. Whenever I get the overarching like sound with all of them in, I wish I had a little more discipline to physically turn things off. I don't know that I always need them turned on. It's more out of just not having that instinct to dedicatedly turn them off. I think many times I could, but it is again, true in there that a lot of times I will go to one of these microphones that I know has an attribute of something that you would be thinking you had to do with an EQ on a thing. Like to me, the snare sound, the main reason for that many microphones to me is simply that the complexity of what the snare sound is just not about the close-up mic.
PreSonus has everything you need for your music or podcast production. Studio One is a great choice for your DAW, whether you are writing songs, creating EDM and pop music, recording bands, mixing, mastering, composing for film, or recording voice and producing a podcast of your own. A flexible sketchpad, chord charts, key recognition, effects pedals, amp simulators, virtual instruments including a killer drum machine, built-in vocal tuning with Melodyne, and 37 fantastic sounding plugins for mixing will allow you you to create whatever inspires you. PreSonus provides you everything you need for your studio, from microphone to digital interface to headphones and speakers, so that you can easily set up your home studio for professional production. Get started now with the low-cost Studio One Artist and join PreSonus Sphere for access to all their software, a complete learning library, and creative collaboration in the community at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. If your goal was to climb Mount Everest, you would hire a Sherpa to guide you to the summit. If you wanted to sail around the world, you would hire a seasoned sea captain for a safe voyage. And if you wanted to try skydiving, you wouldn't just jump out of an airplane without being strapped to an expert, right? So why would you send off your mix for mastering without knowing that it was ready first? Wouldn't it be great to have a professional mastering engineer with a trained ear to guide you through the final stages of mixing? Brian Murphy is your trusted guide at soundporter.com. Home of the iterative mastering process, where you get to interact with a professional mastering engineer who listens to what you want and will give you mix feedback to help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo so that you can hear it before you buy it at soundporter.com. All right, cool. So what's kind of cool to hear you talking about micing up the drums and having so many mics in there, which is encouraging, is this idea that it's okay to have lots of microphones that are in there, but then they're just turned down in the mix. It's not like you're compelled to have each one of them at loud, full volume if you're going to use it. Otherwise, you're cheating. And that it can be okay to have stuff that's just barely subtly tucked in there to fill out the full spectrum like that.
Yeah. And I think they all combine together. Like I notice aspects of the drum sound, that sort of vanish when I turn off mics that look like they're almost off.
Yeah.
If with that many mics, if I were to turn 4 mics that look like they're not contributing anything to it, there's absolutely a noticeable, sound. And I feel like where the mics are and how they come together has to do with, like this whole picture. Though that's what I'm thinking when I put them up, is that this is this part of the drum sound. So my intention is to sort of use them all together. And then as a byproduct, like as a result of that, I started realizing in mixing that I could make massive changes by focusing on one of those things and building a sound like off of that in a cut and paste sort of like, oh, now the thing just changed, and that might have been something that I would have had to have orchestrated, with some engineering feat, rather than, so the intent is to use them all together, and I do think that they come together in a way. And there's obviously a lot of phase, stuff that you have to worry about.
How do you manage that? How do you make sure the phase isn't screwing things up, but is additive? And then how would you suggest to us that we arrive at our own palette of all these crazy mics blending together?
The phase, there's a lot of data about phase. Some of it, by the book, you can, do measurements, do the classic things, to avoid things, equidistance of certain things.
You're probably going to have to be more specific for us.
Yeah. So for instance, if you have 7 microphones, like on a drum set, and actually this is, gets into something that I learned when I was coming in to doing stuff that was highly educational to me, was the Glyn Johns, thing, that top, side, front, thing, and the way that you fine tune the drum sound and what you're focusing on is, largely in that thing. The snare is usually the loudest part of the drum set. And to me, the snare sound, particularly like on jazz records and things, touches on what I was sort of talking about before we dropped, the thing that where the snare sound comes from to me is about all of the things that you hear around it. Similar to if you walk in a room, with a drum set playing, you hear a sound, right? You don't hear like 7 different components, individually. You hear like one drum set playing.
Right.
So, the measurement in terms of the phase thing, and it's very, all of the rules that I've seen, I understand where they apply under specific things, but I also feel like you just have to try stuff. Because basically, some information would say, okay, pick the loudest sound source, make, a handful of the rooms of the microphones be equidistant from that snare. Mm-hmm. And then chances are that your snare is not going to be out of phase between those 3 microphones. You can pick a different element to use that mentality on. It can be that you want to bring out like a floor tom, or some other element of it. But the equidistant thing is basically, the way the phase cancellation is problematic is that the sound of one sound reaching 2 different sound sources at different times and then being combined into mono means that, they will either couple together and work, or they will cancel, themselves out. So doing a lot of listening and a lot of, measurement and trying things, ultimately, I do a lot of checking of the phase while I'm getting sounds as much as I can.
How often are you flipping the phase, the polarity, or is it more about moving the mic position to try and get it?
I'll start with moving the mic thing around, but I feel like there is, with a lot of these microphones that I have, the variables like the high, the overhead microphones will move based on where the cymbals are, and that can be a big shift right there, in terms of whether or not you're putting a microphone on the cymbals based on how it's going to work with the snare, or whether or not you're putting it on the cymbals based on how much isolation you're getting off of, you know what I mean? I think there's these different ways that you're looking at it. So if I know that the overhead, a drummer comes in and maybe his cymbals are really low, and if I mic'd them up really close and then they're problematic with the snare drum, then I would change that. But I think ultimately there's so many combinations of phase relationships between the number of mics that I have going that I don't know if I'm just getting lucky, whether or not I have a good intuition on it, but I used to spend more time really measuring to avoid phase. And I've moved into more of a process of putting the microphone where I want it to work. Having said that, it's been a lot of time in this room. And I think some of the snapshots that I'm taking, and that's kind of how I think of them, are really known to me.
Right.
So
you've tried, they've been proven.
Yeah.
When you say measure to get the phase, you're talking about trying to match the distance for two microphones to whatever the focal element is.
Yeah. And
whether
then
it's the snare or the floor tom or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, a lot of that really becomes problematic depending on what the drummer, presents you.
Right.
So a lot,
I have a question about a very interesting drummer. So this actually comes from Nick Krill, who's been on the podcast as well, of the Spinto band. And he asked you to share a story about working with the French Kicks. And I will say that I saw the French Kicks here in Nashville, and they were awesome. And I would describe it as an incredibly tall drummer sitting and playing an incredibly low drum kit.
Yeah. He's super above the kit. And I feel like that gives a particular snap on the wrist and elbow, as the hand comes down.
Interesting. Yeah.
That he's hitting with the weight coming that way, rather than what I see a lot of players do, where they don't necessarily come to a full I guess, full extension, in there. The experiences with the French kicks were pretty cool. We made a record in a house that was pretty new in the wintertime out on Montauk in Long Island.
My brother had a beach house there. It was actually a trailer home.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's, and like the winter time out there, it was a really great time to be there because it was just total isolation, a lot of snow. The heating system was not working. So
even the sharks were gone.
Yeah. It was very cold, but we were in a house and we brought a lot of equipment into the house and made a really special record.
It sounds like fun.
Yeah.
What were some things, any fun stories about those guys? What's their instrumentation? Do you remember off the top of your head?
On this record, there was bass, there was drums, there was piano, there was guitar. And it was not a big live thing. Things were layered. There was like a lot of nuance, that we were chasing, if that makes any sense. And very guided by a vibe, and that notion of being steeped in your superstitions, I think applies, to this. I remember it being like fairly slow moving in certain ways because the considerations were really about like getting an emotional petri dish to be in the right state to do something, and not really as much at all about getting performances, right. And then I think a lot of that time we were also doing the mix. And so, and I think my role with them in that, and I do this a lot with bands, was really facilitating, them to do things themselves. So the equipment, I basically took the equipment they had and I brought a bunch of my stuff, there, and we set up an environment in there. But I think a lot of the role was more of me being in an engineer, sort of perspective than not, and kind of really just facilitating them to sort of make discoveries about like how to do things. So it might be that I would come in and, maybe slightly gain stage something different from what they were doing and interpret, something that was happening and try and sort of present the same idea if it was sort of like out of bounds in an engineering way, or I don't know.
Right. And when you talk about the gear going out there and then also the gear where you're normally recording, are you on analog tape using a console? It looked like you had an MCI 600 in there, or are you in Pro Tools? Let's talk about that. And how do you like to incorporate, the old school, new school?
I've got so many tape machines. It's silly. And I don't use them a lot. I've been trying to integrate the 1-inch 8-track. I have an MPEX 440C 1-inch 8-track, which I'm sort of thinking might be cool to sort of put into the picture so that when you're approaching the end of a mix, that you could maybe drop that mix in 8 channels down to tape, and try and give it like a little bit of a different vibe, similar, I guess, just putting your mix onto like 1/2 or 1/4 inch. I think that the old school thing, I think, has a lot to do with the equipment, the microphones in particular, the preamps, and the mentality. And then I have sort of moved away. It's like I'm not all that fascinated with tape machines anymore. I like them, but when I use it the most, there's a band that I've done a lot of work with, and this is maybe a tangent, but it's relative to the French Kicks thing. It's like I feel like there's like a handful of bands that I work with that my role is specifically being like, okay, we met because I am seen as somebody who makes records, but the thing that you know how to do is so much more important than the things that I might know how to do in terms of a technical thing or an engineering thing. So I've worked a lot with bands that the mission is really making a record that we're making, but a lot of it is really a longer term process that is inevitably helping people, get to a point when they can do the stuff themselves. So
right.
The
You
tape
like to
thing,
facilitate.
yeah. The tape thing, where I use it the most lately is if somebody has things that they recorded that were all like drum machines and things like that, then I will take a lot of those sounds and I'll just process sounds. And that's usually a combination of, EQ and, compression and other things, but printing sounds and then sort of having that be what I'll mix from. I used to track religiously everything to tape, and it's not that I don't think the sound of tape is really good or awesome, but I do think I've become an audio tech over the years, which is largely how I've afforded to have a lot of the equipment that I have, because like that MCI console that I have, I bought that I think for $1,000.
Nice.
And just fixed it, recapped it, did the whole thing. So the tape thing, once I got to be a tech, this is where the superstition melted away from that, where it's like, all right, I know we're all talking about the warmth and the magic, of tape. I have kind of reached the conclusion that I think that the process of working on a tape machine and the limitations and the lack of the computer and all of, the serial nature of recording, having the limitation of like track counts and length of tape, and these other things, I feel like the value of the tape machine has more to do with the process imparting a thing than I really have cared to believe that tape itself is the thing, especially because, for people who really know what's going on in tape, there's so many choices, right? It's like, how are you going to, what's the bias scheme? What's the EQ curve that you're using? What tape speed, what formula of tape? And those I really, because I started making records when it was just on tape. So I believe that those things are real. But if you can't get into making those decisions, then I feel like you're more in the territory of thinking that there's this magic bullet called tape, right? That is just going to impart some magical sound. And it's kind of like, I don't know. I mean, for years, I would always track to tape and I would always be tracking simultaneous so that in case tape machine went down, because that's just what they do, that you didn't lose something in there. And there were definitely times when I had to switch and present the choice of, do we stop and fix the tape machine or do we keep going? Yeah. And so I would have to play back to the people in the room who were adamant about recording on tape. And there was never a time that anybody guessed accurately. That's just funny. With the tape compression itself, to me, if you're using it that way, that accounts for something that I feel like when people A/B them, the extra dynamic punch that, isn't there equates louder, equates better.
So you're saying you play back the tape or the Pro Tools for people in the room, and they never guessed which was which. They would always pick Pro Tools as what was supposed to be the tape because it's just a little bit livelier in a A/B comparison like that. What about the band Pile, for example, that I was talking about? Is that one where you recorded into Pro Tools as far as you remember? Yeah. I think everything now for years has been, the basics are going in, and that's also the number of mics that I'm using at that point. I've settled on something where I'd rather have those choices, and I
it will absolutely be a thing that later in the process, I may take sounds, and if I really, especially like I said, if it's like an electronic project, I would process sounds so that I can get whatever attributes of the tape are on there. But Pile, we're all digital.
That's cool, and that one sounds great. That's got like a great example of a really controlled low end and a huge room sound that would make somebody go, "Oh man, this is recorded on tape." Yeah. So well done with that. Yeah. Now, what about when you're in Pro Tools? Have you found some tape plugins that you really enjoy when you do like to do that kind of stuff?
Nah.
All right, cool. There you go. I love it.
No way.
That's the shortest answer yet.
Oh my God. Yeah. I think all the plugin questions will be that way.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about vocals though. For example, Titus Andronicus, A Pot in Which to Piss, and a bunch of the other ones, actually, and Pile as well. Great vocal effects. And I wondered how you, and I think you're going to give me the answer because you just said that's your answer about plugins. So it probably wasn't a mix thing. Talk about how you got some of those vocal effects. Is that the PA in the room that I'm hearing? Is that sort of, vocals through guitar amp too and stuff like that?
Yeah. Basically for both of those bands and I do this a lot. I will sometimes switch what the wild card track is, but when I'm tracking vocals, I'll usually have, like a sensible, good microphone, in a conventional sense, like, an 87 or the U47, although I don't tend to use that much for vocals somehow. And then I will have an amplifier of some kind, and this changes, will be set up in the outer barn area, and I will take a split from the clean vocal, and then I just have like an effect, my pedal setup for my guitar rig is usually in the control room, and so I'll feed 1 to 2 or sometimes more different amplifiers. I use the grain silo as a reverb.
Wait, you have a grain silo?
Yeah.
Dude, I was traveling this summer and I kept telling people I really want to find a place with a grain silo so I can make an echo chamber. That's great.
Oh yeah. It's super cool.
All right, hit the brakes. Let's tell us exactly what you got going on for that. We got to know.
Okay. So the grain silo, it should be way cooler than it is. Like I should have pulleys, that change where the speaker is and where the microphone, and get really fancy with it. But that isn't the case. There is an SM57 hiding under a little umbrella because pigeons can get into this thing. So there is like 4 feet of 100 plus years of compacted pigeon shit, like down on the ground, and there's a speaker in there, and then the 57 is like covered to keep from getting like showered on there, and but you can really do. I've really discovered quite a bit of things. The type of frequencies that you put in. You can definitely charge the space differently and get into things where you'll get more of a length of a tail and not just with EQing things, and how loud you put, your sound in. And so I get a lot of mileage out of that. So it's not just one stock thing. So
you put a big speaker in there so that you can actually push it if you want.
Yeah. There's a powered speaker that's just, been in there now for, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years.
But I mean, we're not talking about a computer desktop, little 5-inch cone or something.
No. I have like it's like probably a 10-inch woofer. It's like a small powered speaker.
Okay.
Yeah, like bigger than a NS10. Like that sort of size, and it's probably 60 watts or something like that.
And
so
have you guesstimated what the length of the reverb time is?
No. not really. There's just a lot of those. It's just I can get really techie on some stuff, and then other ones. It to me is a very recognizable sound to me, and so yeah.
Which
I would
record should we listen to get a sense of that? Is that you think that's in our playlist? Is there one where you really featured that?
I mean, it's there's a lot of it on the Seer. There's a lot like I put it in use for Real Estate's record Days. That was the first time that I used it, and I spent probably like a week. I think every sound on that record got processed through that. Sometimes I'll do it that way, which I kind of have to because like especially wind noise, or sometimes there are pigeons in there. So it's unpredictable in terms of using it all the time live and getting keeper results. But yeah, it's not a super long reverb. It's a really elegant sound. And it has like a really nice, it almost reminds me of the Lexicon. Trying to remember which one it was, the 200 or the
280 or something like that, or the Rockstars, I added that Real Estate Days to the playlist just now, so you can go check that one out and really hear what that sounds like. So that's very cool. The secret to a great mix is to start with great source tracks. And this means you need great microphones. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia brings you the new BB29 Signature Series microphone to help your recordings add clarity and detail to your mixes. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design with a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity without distracting colorations and distortions. The new BB29 microphone has a Class A discrete amplifier circuit, extremely low self-noise, and transformer-coupled output to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. The legendary API sound can be described as punchy and bold with a distinct in-your-face presence. For more than 50 years, API Audio has been advancing their design of consoles, mic preamps, compressors, and EQs, but what API founder Saul Walker got perfect in the very beginning were the proprietary op-amp and transformer designs. And today, API still offers the very best for your studio with dedicated rack units for mic pre, EQ, and compression, and consoles from small to large with the box 1608, 2448, or full-size legacy access, and they even introduced the original 500 series lunchbox to studios everywhere. But most importantly of all, no matter which gear you choose from API, you can count on the original op-amps and transformer designs to make sure you always get that legendary API sound. Because the next record you make could be your best record ever. Visit apiaudio.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins and PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. All right, dig it. Any other stories you want to share about that thing? Any typical head scratcher things that somebody's going to go through when they go to make their own echo chamber where you want to say, I guess you just say, don't worry about pulleys and reverb lengths. Just stick a speaker and a mic in there.
I mean, you know, the direct sound is a thing, you know, so picking a spot where your speaker is not going to end up in your microphone.
Right.
Is actually pretty huge. And then I think after that, I think, spaces that it's a really good way, to do it. Often people don't have a space that has that big of a sound to it. I remember doing things like that in smaller rooms where I ended up with something like a lot boxier and pingier and
right.
not as useful. So, some of it is just the size.
You gotta have the right kind of space. Yeah.
Yeah. And if it has a good sound to it, and just try and, I don't know, but I think it's a great tool to use. And frankly, I think that there's a lot of things, like when people think of reverb and they're thinking about what it's good for, I feel like we're more aware of like the effect of it that we notice than we are in understanding that some ambience on a thing is, and you're probably not going to hear the value of it until you're mixing it, will allow that sound to exist in a space in a way that would then, when you solo it, you're like, oh, it's like, all right, I hear the reverb, but what the reverb is really doing, and the reason that it's maybe valuable, except when it's effective, is that it's actually placing a sound in its own like little space. And so what is my point to that is that I would encourage people to play around with charging any acoustic spaces, that they have. And to that end, I even think recording and not deadening things, So
for example, my room where the drums might be, but maybe the amps were isolated during the tracking, you're saying that you would encourage us to have speakers out there so that when we go to do mixing, we can crank all the sounds back up in that space and start blending that into the mix?
Yeah.
Potentially?
Yeah. As just like a thing. And in terms of the awareness of that, not necessarily expecting the same thing as you might when you put something through and you're listening to it for that sound. I don't know if that makes sense, but that the benefit won't necessarily be something that you hear when you're getting the sound, but that you may get a lot of it may become easier to mix certain things.
Okay, cool.
In ways that you weren't necessarily expecting with some ambience. I mean, it may not, but it's but
yeah.
Well,
I need to do that again. I've done that in the past, but I haven't set up speakers so that they're like instantly accessible in my live room to sort of reamp the room. And I know a guy, Adam Long in St. Louis. He regularly does that. He mixes in his apartment as his studio. And he will just sit there and play everything back out through his apartment and re-mic it and put that into the mix, just like you're describing. So I would agree that it sounds like a pretty cool plan. One of the other bands that you worked with is Jonathan Gatt, if I'm saying that right. Cue the Machines. Great video in there where it's just hilarious at first, but also like, it's clearly a departure from tape machines and consoles. I mean, because you're like everything's sampled and chopped up, and you've done a lot of cool stuff. Can you share a story about working with those guys?
I mean, the chop up aspect of that is all after, the fact, and not. I mean, Jonathan does quite a bit of endless, like tweaking around with things after. The tracking, has been done, and even after like the mixing is done, and he's very in the moment. So that chop up thing is kind of interesting because it makes you think that the record was made that way, and it's really like a thing that he did after the fact. The recording part of it, they were very much, and I want to say that I believe he resides very much in the present. And it is all about capturing them. And there's not going to be a second take, necessarily of that. And then the way that it sounds like it was a very studioized thing is just a lot of the samples and a lot of him cutting up stuff after the fact. But
now, would it have come back to you again for a final mix once that happened, or was it it gets finished up at that post-production stage?
that record was really interesting because things were tracked in a lot of different places. And so like I kept sort of having things coming back at different phases of it. But one of the things that was really quite a process to figure out was so there'd be the mix, right? And normally you would think that you want to finalize a mix before you change, the length of the song and do like other things like that. So there was like a whole lot of phases of that were like, okay, a mix was done that wasn't the final mix. And then he would do some editing, which would change the length of the track. And now it would be like even in another session. And then, so there was a lot of that. It was very, it sounds like I'm maybe saying that it was done the wrong way. It was technically done in the absolute, like, by the book wrong way, to do it by virtue of things like that, because there was a lot of things like, okay, there's a mix. He would become inspired to do sound, things to it. And then he would do those things and that would become the version, but it wasn't the version. And then the mix that he had done the editing to was maybe not even by anybody's assessment of a mix. So suddenly it would be like, okay, we have this thing and we've changed length and we have these, cool new elements in here, but the snare's not loud enough. Okay, so what are we going to do about that? Because now we're on to this new version of it. So, I would get phone calls that would show up and I would get sent things, during processes. He would just grab, the thing and just start doing things. So I started getting mixes sent to me after I thought maybe mixes were like done, where there were different versions, different, lengths, snare drums, like, from the original session taken and lined up in the way that, somebody, this is not to be insulting or disparaging, the amount of methodical things that I go through because of the technical things that I know being an engineer to avoid certain things. If somebody doesn't know any of those and they just know that they're allowed to be like, oh, well, of course I can take the original snare from the original session and just line it up. And I've never heard of phase.
Right.
So I don't know later on what isn't working about this, but it either works or it doesn't work. And so there was a lot of things like that. There was also, the style of the drumming on that record. He's such like a frenetically, and it's a very cool thing. Some of the things that we encountered were that some of the songs were recorded from more of like a jazz, point of view than some of the other ones. And so where you would really need to have a backbone for all of the activity of the drums, if that makes any sense. I mean, the drums are so fast in there that it's a lot of lightly hitting things, but it's a rock song with a lot of things that have to cut through something and they have to sit on this backbone. So there was like kind of like a lot of steps where we did processing, where I would get somebody else's mix and I would, do processes on it to try and create new stems for him to be able to mix, because inevitably whatever you finished thinking that was done inevitably was going to turn into something else. and he, wanted to mix the stuff. So it was an interesting process to come up with like, ways to enable somebody to be able to do that. And then in a few cases to be like, okay, so the reason the snare will never show up until we mute the snare that we brought back in here is because it is latent with it and it's canceling. And by the time you'd get one or the other one at the volume to work, so a few little obstacles like that, but a lot of it was kind of watching things just be like, wow, none of this should be working. And I think it was a really cool record.
Yeah,
really
it's a great way to come up with something special. Just that the push and pull of those two things. And I had written down a question earlier, which I didn't ask, which was just sort of, are you a fan of early Pink Floyd? And I think of Pink Floyd in this. I'm going to guess maybe you were, but I think of Pink Floyd in the studio as a band that there was that kind of push pull going on all the time, and that's why some of those records turned out so great. Is because it was the butting of heads in the process.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. I have two questions before we close out here, mix related. So when you are mixing, what do you like to do on your mix bus? What do you like to mix through to kind of get things to sound right? And then, are you using your console? Are you doing it in the computer? And are there plugins? Say whatever you want about plugins. Are there plugins that you like using or not using? And then how do you make sure that you do get your low end right on these records?
The mixing, I really like the SSL G series plugin. Not because I think it sounds anything like an SSL, but it's just a really good utility, the
SSL
EQ.
Duende or the Waves version?
The Waves version.
Okay.
So I use that quite a bit. I like multibands quite a bit. And I tend to do a type of EQ is actually being done with the EQ, but I feel like there is an awareness of the way you can shape the EQ of a sound with a multiband, which is just actually controlling the dynamics of certain parts of it. So right. I feel like I've kind of settled, into that. The mix chain is pretty convoluted these days. I think the workflow that I have gotten into sort of ruled out a lot of things that I used to probably do that were more about like, I'm mixing to the console, so I'm actually doing a lot with the console and writing faders and developing the sound on the console. And, for the sake of recallability and workflow, the way the console setup is happening right now is that it's kind of a template thing. And I guess we've heard things about a lot of big mix, engineers who do a similar thing. I know like Michael Brower does quite a bit of having certain pieces of gear that he doesn't really touch or see that are in the back of his rack, and you're just sending, to it. And I tend to use the analog gear in the mix in that way. It's definitely a very analog mix, and I'm using the MCI console, and I have a Neve 5544 series 12 channel that I'm using, and then I have like a modular Neve, the 8816, I guess is what that actually is. So the mix chain is basically three different mix chains. There's one that's very neutral and not EQ'd. Even the way I'm using the console, the 600 series console is, I basically am coming out of Pro Tools 8 channels into that, and I actually have duplicates of each of those. One is just clean, no EQ, and the other one, I sort of painstakingly came up with some very gentle EQ, curves that stay on this other one. So I guess that's really like parallel, in that I've got 2 sets of them. So it's really like whatever the EQ is doing, it's even less than if you were doing it to the whole thing.
Interesting.
And
that's an analog EQ in the console, or that's something going on back in Pro Tools?
No. The analog EQ on the channel strips, that
Right.
The stuff is coming through. And then, so I've got a clean version of that goes into the Neve 8816. I have the main output of that console goes through this. What's that? I'm going to sound stupid. The Baxendal EQ. What's the?
I think you said about Baxendal or something.
Baxendal, yeah. So I have a. Strangely, this is pretty funny. It's actually a hi-fi preamp that can take +4, and so the main output goes into that. There's a slight EQ going on that I don't really touch on that. And then that hits a pair of, trying to remember if it goes into distressors, and then it goes into a Manley variable mu, and then
that's
goes
intense,
into an Avalon, and so that's one pass, and that there's a duplicate of that I send into a Compex or compressor.
Nice.
And that is pretty aggressively compressed, and that comes back into the Neve, and there's a little bit of EQ, and that is mixed in as the second chain. And
now,
then
how much of this are you listening through while you're doing the production with the band? Is this all happen later?
Oh, none. Yeah, it's basically just the mixed chain,
Okay.
that's up. And to me, I've made reference to the topography of stuff. To me, though I know that there's an EQ, thing that's happening on the channel strips that I'm EQing on the MCI, I'm not thinking about it with a lot of concern about what I chose. I spent a lot of time coming up with the gain structure, like about 3 years of like micro tweaking until I came up with the thing that was like, this is a way that I can leave this stuff. And to me, it's actually more about being like, okay, that EQ is a real EQ, and it's the sound of this MCI console. So a little bit of that is going to go good. And even if I have like 3 dB of 12K on there, and that's too much in some sense, it's like, the EQ and things that happen in the session are kind of like pushing out there. And I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is like, I know I have a kind of a console with a certain kind of an EQ. Actually, along with the Manleys, I forgot to mention the Pultecs, they're in there. So
Right.
there's, those are going on there. They're not conventionally like, a bus EQ, I mean, at the levels that you're mixing at, you could probably say that it would be hard to always use them on there without them saturating ways that you wouldn't want them to do. But ultimately, what I like about this combination, and even the compressors that I have, I'm feeding the Manley into the Avalon, and I'm not compressing with either one of them. There's no compression happening.
It's just tonal.
It's basically because of the makeup of the topography of circuitry. I experienced this the strongest the first time that Greg Calby at Sterling Sound mastered, a record, and going back to I had said earlier, the mastering thing for me was huge. in teaching me certain things. And so the first time I worked with Greg on something, I watched him make really huge tonal changes simply by the choice of the equipment that he was coming through before he turned any knobs, and there were certain cables, that he used, digital cables that brought out like a very small amount, of tonality, in a certain area, and then this compressor and this compressor, because of the choice of going through certain, topographies, transformers or lack of a transformer, or, whether or not it's a copper or a nickel, tube circuitry. All of these things to me have a lot of sound, and the coloration of those sounds to me is really important. This also reminds me of the Nev EQ that I have. The Nev console has like a really basic EQ on it. And it's just, the mid-range is like three frequency selects, and they're inductors, and, they're discrete, circuitry. And I remember I had heard people talk about discrete things a lot, but I didn't really understand it until I realized when I would EQ things on this, I was like, yeah, I know I can choose between the 3.9 and the 1.6. Ultimately, what I hear is that when I use a different EQ select, I'm clicking in a distinctive circuit, and I hear a tonal thing across a very wide thing that sounds different from the other ones, less than I hear whether or not the EQ center frequency is what I'm focusing on. So that sort of mentality is how I tend to use the analog equipment. I presume that I've gotten the sounds where I want them in ways that have a distinctive tone by the time I'm getting to the mixing. So the mixing for me is that I have the digital, the plugins, the session information to be able to save a lot of data. And, I definitely, though I don't really care that much about plugins, but that isn't to say that I don't use them. I tend not to go down like any road where I invest any belief whatsoever in any plugin that's supposed to be designed after its analog equivalent. I'm just like, yeah, I know I'll be able to use that plugin and do really good stuff with it. There's no part of me that even lets myself look at it like, oh, this is an 1176. I'm like, that's, and I'm sure that the people who really know about that could, teach me many things. And I'm sure that's wrong to assume that there's no correlation. But so there's basically the mix chain for me is the analog aspect of it is really, because I do believe in the harmonics and the things that happen. I also believe because of analog equipment's limitation on the kind of volume you can put through it. It also forces the thing that goes in line with my belief, and I think you can hear it in a lot of the records that I've done, that there's a lot of dynamics. And so things that force you to, work at a quieter volume where there's some room, to keep things from harmonic distortion and other, things that make the gear go bad. That's kind of how I'm using that. And there's a whole lot of color that comes from it, but I don't, I think the most analog components of any of the work that I've done are actually because I started from a time period that I think I know what the sound of analog, like I know what that means. I've got beyond it being a superstition. And I think anytime, whatever it is, even if somebody was like, I'm trying to make the most digital sound, I think the key is to know that you're moving in a certain direction, and to know that you want to move in a certain direction, and to see that you're moving towards that. So
yeah, that's cool. That's cool. And then what about when it comes to just judging the low end? I mean, do you have a process of listening to different speakers or walking around the studio? Is there some way that you feel confident that you've nailed the low end on your mix?
That I think the mastering years that I did actually helped me there as well. I have a lot of speakers in the control room, and I keep a pair of speakers out in the outer barn area, and I feel like I clinically work to get the mix together in the control room. And I do, especially if I'm mixing unattended, I spend a lot of time listening out of the control room and listening to it coming through this big room. And of course, there's no stereo image or, anything else like that. But
just another place that you can be familiar with it and know if it feels right.
It's to me, it's a real world reference, too. But I guess as far as getting the low end right, that is, I think I learned a lot about what low end wrong is from both the work that I did before I knew and then mastering things. So I think there's a little bit of, I have a pretty good barometer for where the low end should be, and then I check it. I'm very involved in the mastering of the records that I do, whether or not I master them myself or whether or not I work with the mastering engineer. But to me, I'm thinking about the mastering and where the low end is when I'm miking, the stuff up. And I feel like there's a lot all the way through the process that I think has really a lot to do with not compressing things.
Well, that's cool. That's cool. And I like what the takeaway about you saying, you learned what low end wrong is. And I think that if we're even listening to this and the discussion of low end is meaningful to us, then we already have our own barometer of what low end wrong is. So as you learn to deal with low end wrong and fix things and handle it, you can recognize when it creeps back up. But let me, if you don't mind, let me take you to our closing question because we've run out of time. But this has been fantastic, man. This one is hypothetical, and we're going to take you in the Wayback Studio machine. You get to go back and find young Kevin, and you just show up, with angelic wings and a halo, and you say, or whatever, and you say, "Hey, dude, here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day." What advice would you go back and give to yourself at the beginning of your recording journey and process, if you could?
God, I don't know. That's not a very good answer. I hope there's a marker you're throwing out there. I had a similar thing when I was thinking about the idea of what a failure, is. I know that there are so many things that I would tell the younger version of myself, but inevitably I would mostly tell myself that just buckle down to be lost for a good amount of time and keep trying and don't be afraid to understand that you're gonna be, and that it's a progression. And I feel like this is definitely a thing that I'm interested in with bands too, that your growth, the difference in looking at an isolated incident versus somebody's career or a body of work is that, you see the progression. So the things that I'm better at now, there's than I was when I was, 19. There's absolutely a lot of gray area to me as like, okay, these things I'm better at, and I have a career because I got better at those things, because I wouldn't have had a career if I didn't find a way out of them and how to learn things. But there's a lot of value to the really fucked up, technically wrong things that I was doing, which I constantly, that story of Yonatan, that there aren't, to me, it's like learn the rules so you can break the rules. But learn them, because if you're just breaking the rules all the time, you are relying on happy accidents and you're not really getting closer to being able to control stuff. And there's only so much luck, that you're liable to actually have.
Good point.
But
I like that. Learn the rules so that you can break the rules. And, with all the records that you've done that have such a, it almost sounds like you captured chaos in a bottle sometimes, because there's so much going on with reverbs and delays and creative arrangements and all that kind of stuff. And hearing you say that, it's just that reminder of, if you're just relying on luck, you're not going to end up with a whole bunch of records that try and do that still sound great. But when you combine it with learning the rules and then breaking them and accepting the happy accidents where they come, then that might be the right combination for it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, man. This has been great to have you here and great to meet you and to really dive into your philosophy and all this stuff. And I loved learning all these concepts of capturing the room and layering all those sounds. I think that's exciting stuff, and I'm going to have some great takeaways for that. Let the rock stars know how they can find you. Where should they go to meet you, hear your music, learn more about you, or contact you for their next record?
Yeah, you can reach me. My website is just www.kevinsmcmahon.com. Social media, I should be using more than I do. I'm on there, but I don't tend to really check it. I don't know. I'm so allergic. Maybe
we just need to nudge you to be more grandiose and start using social media like you suggested.
Yeah. Well, I need to hire a team of high schoolers is what I need to do actually. And it would be, that would be my
That's funny.
My biggest asset.
Well, groovy, man. Well, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And
thanks for having me.
I look forward to coming and seeing your studio up in the barn sometime.
Do come up anytime. It'd be great. And I'd like to see your space too.
All right, man. Yeah, groovy. Come visit when you're in Nashville. All right, man. Yep. Good to talk to you. Cheers.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, Presonus, API Audio, Isotope, Sound Porter Mastering, Jay-Z Microphones, and Spectra 1964. You will find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio, and they're going to help you make your best record ever. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.